Dr. Anna Lembke is a psychiatrist, author, and professor at Stanford University and chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She received her undergraduate degree in humanities from Yale University and her medical degree from Stanford. A clinician scholar, Dr. Lembke has published more than 100 peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, and commentaries. Her books include Drug Dealer MD and Dopamine Nation, a New York Times and Los Angeles Times bestseller, which explores how to combine the science of desire with the wisdom of recovery to find balance in an overindulgent era. Dr. Lembke was one of the first in the medical community to sound the alarm regarding opioid overprescribing and the opioid epidemic. Anna sits on the board of several state and national addiction-focused organizations, has testified before various committees in the United States House of Representatives and Senate, keeps an active speaking calendar, and maintains a thriving clinical practice. You can keep up to date with her work at www.annalemke.com. So Anna, whenever you're ready, feel free to get started. I'm really excited about this one.
Great. Well, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, mainly about my book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And then I really hope that we get to have an interactive dialogue. Please feel free to put questions in the chat or however you all do questions, but really hoping to interact with folks and engage in a discussion with you when I'm done talking. So what I'd like to do is really tell the story of how our brains have evolved over millions of years to approach pleasure and avoid pain, and how we do that reflexively. And then I'd like to talk about how this ancient wiring, which has been so important for our survival, is actually not working out very well for us in the modern world, where we have access to so many feel-good substances and behaviors right at our fingertips. And then I'd like to talk about what we can do about it as individuals by understanding this through the lens of neuroscience, specifically advances in the neuroscience of addiction, but also holding up people in recovery from addiction as modern day prophets for the rest of us for how to navigate this dopamine saturated world. So let's start with the brain. One of the most interesting findings in neuroscience in the past 50 to 75 years is that pain and pleasure are co-located in our brains. So the same parts of our brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like a balance. So if you imagine there's like a board on a central fulcrum, kind of like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground, but when that balance is at rest, it's level with the ground. So when we do something pleasurable, our balance tips to the side of pleasure, and when we experience pain, it tips to the side of pain. But one of the overarching rules governing this balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance after any deviation from neutrality. And that level balance is called homeostasis. So let's say, for example, in my case, I eat a piece of chocolate, or I read a romance novel, or I watch a YouTube video of Dr. Pimple Popper. These are all activities that are highly reinforcing for me. I get a little tip of my pleasure-pain balance deep in the emotion centers of my brain. And I get a little release of dopamine in that reward pathway. So dopamine is a very interesting molecule. It was actually only discovered as a human neurotransmitter in the 1950s. Neurotransmitters are those molecules that allow two neurons to communicate. So neurons are these long, spindly cells in our brains that transmit the electrical circuit that make us who we are, but they don't actually touch end to end. There's a little gap called the synapse, and that gap is bridged by neurotransmitters, which allow this very careful neuromodulation. So dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's one of the fundamental neurotransmitters in our experience of pleasure, motivation, and reward. And it might even be more important for motivation than it is, in fact, for pleasure. For example, there's a very famous experiment where scientists engineered a rat to have no dopamine. And what they discovered was when they put food into the rat's mouth, it ate the food and seemed to get pleasure from eating and swallowed the food. But if they put that food even a single body length away, the rat would starve to death. So it wasn't motivated to get up and go get the food. Suggesting indeed that dopamine has this fairly fundamental role, not just in the experience of pleasure, but in our motivation to do the work to get the reward. Okay, so when we do something pleasurable, the balance tips to the side of pleasure, we release dopamine in that part of the brain called the reward pathway. Also keep in mind that we always have a tonic baseline level of dopamine firing. And really what we're talking about as key here is the deviations either up or down from that baseline level as really key to creating the various behaviors that we're going to be talking about. But remember that as soon as I get a deviation from baseline, my brain will work very hard to restore a level balance or homeostasis. And the way that my brain does that is by downregulating dopamine transmission and downregulating dopamine receptors, not just back down to baseline levels, but actually below baseline. So one of the ways to imagine that is to imagine that there are these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of my balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as the balance is level. They stay on until I'm tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's called the come down, the opponent process mechanism, the after effect, the hangover. We're all probably familiar with that in various forms. But I will say that the extreme version, like a hangover, is something that we can all see. What we're less aware of is the more subtle urge to repeat that behavior that's maybe not even within our conscious awareness. So for example, after I'm done watching a Dr. Pimple Popper YouTube video, I have this kind of strange compulsion to watch it again. That is my mini dopamine deficit state that kind of compels it. I don't even really exactly know why. I may not even really want to watch another Dr. Pimple Popper video, but somehow I'm compelled to do it. That's that dopamine deficit state. This is a very powerful state of physiology because, again, the brain wants to restore homeostasis or a level balance, and will work very hard to do that. And so will get us to do the work to get our next reward. Now, if I don't reach for another reward, right? Let's say it's all done, like I ran out. Then time passes and those neuroadaptation gremlins hop off. I start to upregulate my own dopamine receptors and transmission. And again, homeostasis is restored. I've got a level balance and I can kind of go on with my day. But now we're going to imagine the scenario in which I have plenty of that reward and I have plenty of access to it. And also it's a highly reinforcing, engineered to be highly dopamine releasing kind of reward. So now I don't just have one, I have another and another and another, and I'm doing that over days to weeks to months to years. And what happens is that I eventually end up with enough gremlins on the pain side of my balance to fill this whole room. And they are camped out there. They have their tents and their barbecues. They're not going anywhere soon. This is essentially the addicted brain. I've now reset my hedonic pathway so that I am chronically tilted to the side of pain. I'm in what's called a dopamine deficit state. And that is something that, once created, does not easily reverse itself. And when I'm in that state, essentially now I need to use my drug of choice, not to feel good, but just to get out of this painful state and feel normal. And when I'm not using, I'm walking around with the balance tilted to the side of pain, experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving, intrusive thoughts of wanting to use, often manifested by a physiologic urge to try to relieve the pain that I'm feeling. And this is exactly why people with severe addiction will often relapse even months after stopping, when it's so obvious that their lives are so much better, because they're not walking around with a level balance, right? They're walking around with a balance tilted to the side of pain. Their whole cerebral cortex has become narrowed on trying to manage the craving and pain of their dopamine deficit state. And so every day is an exhaustion, and they finally get to a point where they just kind of relent, and give in, and do what they physiologically feel they must do in order to restore homeostasis. So, my goodness, why on earth would Mother Nature put us to such a test to build, a circuit in our brain that has us approaching pleasure and avoiding pain through this opponent process mechanism or this pleasure-pain balance? It seems like some kind of cruel joke. But if you remember that we have evolved for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, it makes perfect sense, right? What better way to keep us searching and seeking and motivated than to make sure that any pleasure we experience is very temporary and is indeed followed by its opposite, a state of painful craving that then has us seeking the next best thing. It's absolutely genius to keep us alive in a world where resources are incredibly scarce and where we have to constantly be on alert in order to survive. However, this kind of very highly evolutionarily conserved neurobiological mechanism that works so well in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger is really terrible for the world that we have created in about the past 200 to 300 years, which is a world of overwhelming abundance, increasing dispensable income, and increasing amounts of leisure time, not just on any given day, but actually our total number of days, because we're living longer than ever. And we now live in this world in which we have the 4 ingredients that make something potentially very addictive, which are access, quantity, potency, and novelty. So access, it's very clear that with our smartphones, we have 24/7 access, not just to traditional drugs, which we can order like a pizza, but also drugs that didn't exist before, like social media, like online pornography, like video games, like online shopping, all the content online, which really has been very engineered to keep us clicking and swiping, and which has been shown to light up the reward centers of our brain. The screen itself, believe it or not, is reinforcing, almost like a primitive day fire, where we're drawn to just that flickering light, independent of the content that we get from that light. So we have this incredible access. We have this incredible quantity. Again, think about those gremlins and how if you run out of your drug, whether it's alcohol or pot or cocaine, that might potentially leave enough time for those gremlins to hop off in between and for balance to be restored, which might prevent you from getting out of that war with your gremlins, where you accumulate them on the pain side and you end up in that dopamine deficit state. But now we're living in a time and place where we have such access to such quantity for relatively little money that typically it's very easy to keep going. Furthermore, when you think about digital products, whether it's YouTube or TikTok, the supply is literally infinite. There is no running out. It's a bottomless bowl. So we've got increased access, we've got increased quantity, we've got increased potency. So if you take something like the story of opioids, right? Opioids, originally they're found in nature in the poppy plant in the form of opium. Then in the early 1800s, morphine was detected as a way to start with the poppy plant and make a more potent form of opioids in the form of morphine. Then you accelerate to the late 1800s, and then there's the discovery of heroin, which is diacetylated morphine, two acetyl groups added to morphine, which is then even potentially easier to make, more accessible, more available. Fast forward all the way to the present day, fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than heroin, and it's made in a laboratory without even needing the poppy precursor. Cheaply, easily, right? So our technology has accelerated opioids from this, pretty potent thing that we got from a plant to this incredibly potent and lethal substance that we don't even need the plant for. We can make it in a laboratory. And that kind of mirrors the trajectory of almost all intoxicants that humans have been using for centuries. Plus, of course, we have new drugs that didn't exist before, or we have oldish drugs like pornography that you had to work kind of hard to get, even within my lifetime, to get a Playboy magazine, but now, any 5-year-old can go online and get access to pornography, and it's increasingly potent. And then, of course, we have novelty, and novelty is something that dopamine is very sensitive to. Dopamine is really about being aware of our environment, right? And making sure that we are navigating the environment. So dopamine is super sensitive to anything new in the environment. And even in terms of painful stimuli, if it's a very painful stimulus, dopamine will be released in response to that, which is why we can also kind of get addicted to the news in the form of doom scrolling, because it's the novelty, it's the treasure-seeking function that has us dialing in, and that's very reinforcing for us. Plus, of course, we have these algorithms that have been engineered to learn us, whether it's a social media algorithm or really anything that we do online that creates a footprint that is about keeping us engaged, keeping us clicking and swiping, so that we will buy more products, right? It's all about the advertisements. And in order to be able to show us advertisements, they have to learn what we like. But the result is really that we're constantly being offered on this platter things that, these algorithms know that we've clicked on and spent time with before. And now they offer us something similar, but just a little bit different, something new. And of course, that newness is what then hooks us. Oh, maybe this is going to be like that last Dr. Pimple Popper video that I watched, but a little bit different and maybe a little bit more exciting. And that's kind of got us engaged. So this is a really hard world to live in, because it's a world in which we're constantly being invited to consume, where it's not even just, that it's available. It's that the drugs are actually running after us and prompting us. And of course, what I didn't tell you about, but which is part of the, the amazing neuroscience that folks have tapped into, is that we get a little hit of dopamine even just by being reminded of our drug. So, for example, if you train a rat to know that when it sees a light, then it goes to press a lever, that it will get cocaine released into its system from pressing that lever after seeing the light. And then you stick a probe in the rat's brain and you measure dopamine levels. What you find is that, yes, when the cocaine is delivered, there's a huge surge in dopamine. But even before the cocaine is delivered, just when the rat sees the light, there's a tiny little increase in dopamine. So we get high just thinking about our drug, anticipating it. And then that's followed by a little mini dopamine deficit state. Our gremlins hopping on the side of our pain balance in response to euphoric recall. So just the memory, the trigger, or the internal memory, the euphoria that we get for that is then followed by a gremlin or a dopamine deficit state, which is then craving, which is that huge physiologic burden that has us working to go get the drug. And of course, we're constantly being triggered. One of the interesting things that happened in my practice during COVID and sheltering in place was how many of my patients in recovery from severe addiction or trying to get into recovery from severe addiction actually said that sheltering in place in COVID made their lives so much better, because there weren't all the parties. There was no going down, the aisle in the grocery store with all the alcohol. One of my patients even said just getting in his car was like a trigger for him, because his habit had been to get in the car, to go find the drug dealer, to buy the drugs and use in the car. So just having to stay at home was actually an unburdening. Of course, there's the flip side of that too. COVID and sheltering in place has been devastating for many others with addiction. It's also been a time when some people who weren't addicted became addicted, right? Because of all the kind of staying at home and less access to other types of rewards, loss of structure, all of those things. But the point really is that we are now living in an addictogenic world. And what I want to point out and highlight for you is that when you think about that dopamine deficit state and being in that state of withdrawal, and how the universal symptoms of withdrawal are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, and dysphoria, I want you to think about that in light of the rising rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide all over the world in the last 30 to 50 years, okay, which are especially correlated with the socioeconomic wealth of that nation. The richer the country, the higher the rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. And this is really a paradox because we have more of all of these good things that, any objective observer would say we want and need and which should give us pleasure. But I would contend that if you understand this through the lens of our primitive wiring, what we are seeing in terms of rising rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide is actually a result of too much dopamine. It's dopamine overload. Our brains are trying desperately to compensate for all of the pleasure that's triggering all of this dopamine in the reward pathway, and doing that by accumulating these gremlins so that we are individually and collectively ending up in this dopamine deficit state, and therefore experiencing anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. And I believe that that's true in large part because in my clinical practice, I've seen rising rates of people coming in who are desperately anxious, depressed, wanting to end their lives. This is including, otherwise healthy young people who have everything you could ever imagine living here in Silicon Valley and yet can barely get out of bed in the morning. And when we intervene clinically to try to reset their reward pathways, they come out of that depression without having to prescribe an antidepressant, without psychotherapy. So I really, just from my clinical implementation, empirically, clinical implementation, I think that this dopamine problem is really a problem that many of us are struggling from in the modern world. Okay, so in the last little bit, then the question is, what do we do about it? So I think by looking at this problem through the lens of the neuroscience, and also looking at how people with severe addiction have gotten into recovery in our dopamine saturated world, is a way that we can, the rest of us can maybe learn to live better in the world that we live in now. And there are basically three basic tools I'm going to talk about. The first is abstinence, or a dopamine fast. And that is what I recommend to my patients, whether they're over consuming cannabis or alcohol or nicotine or pornography, gambling, social media, video games. I ask them essentially to abstain from their drug of choice for 30 days. Why 30 days? Because 30 days is typically the amount of time that people can wrap their head around. If you ask for longer than that, it gets to be intimidating. It's also true that 30 days from a neuroscientific perspective is on average the amount of time it takes for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. And why is it so important to restore homeostasis? Number one, when we've restored homeostasis, we're more able to take pleasure in modest everyday rewards. We're not only focused and reorganizing our lives around our drug of choice. And number two, it's only once homeostasis is restored that we can actually look back and see the true impact of our use on our lives. When we're chasing dopamine, we're really quite blind to the true consequences of that kind of sensory seeking experience. So the dopamine fast resets reward pathways, allows us to engage in more modest rewards. And also, I'm just seeing in the chat there. Okay. Yes, longer Q&A. We will get there soon. And also allows us to have insight into the true impact of our use on our lives. The other thing is that the science, interestingly, really corresponds with my clinical experience. For example, there's a famous study by Mark Shuckett and colleagues showing that if you take a group of men who are using, adult men who are using alcohol in an addictive way, and you also find that they meet criteria for a major depressive episode, using a diagnostic and statistical manual criteria, and you put those men into a hospital setting where they get no access to treatment for depression, but they also have no access to alcohol, what you find is that after 30 days, 80% of those individuals no longer meets criteria for major depression. In other words, simply stopping alcohol resolves the major depressive episode in the vast majority of those individuals. And that is very consistent with my clinical work. Also, if you look at the work of Nora Volkoff and other neuroscientists who have actually looked at the brain of individuals after they stop using drugs like cocaine, cannabis, alcohol, what you find is that 2 weeks after stopping, they are still in a dopamine deficit state, meaning that their dopamine transmission based on fMRI and PET scans is lower than the dopamine transmission of individuals who have not been using drugs and then stop those drugs in an addictive way. So that tells us that 2 weeks is probably not enough time to reset reward pathways. That also corresponds with my clinical experience. What I always warn patients about is that those first 2 weeks are going to be really awful. Why? Because they will stop using their drug and their balance will tilt to the side of pain and they'll be in withdrawal. But if they can just wait it out and get to weeks 3 and weeks 4, they will find that they're in a place where they're beginning to be able to get perspective and enjoy things again. And many of them will report feeling much, much better than they have in a really long time. So a couple footnotes here. This is not an intervention that I would recommend to somebody who might go into life-threatening withdrawal from alcohol or benzodiazepines. Obviously, that individual needs medical monitoring. This is also not an intervention I would recommend with somebody with a severe addiction who has tried repeatedly to stop on their own and has been unable to. Again, that individual needs more support, needs more help, needs a higher level of care. But for individuals with mild to moderate addictions, or even many of us who are sort of on the pre-addiction spectrum, engaging in the kind of compulsive overconsumption, but not yet tipped over to addiction, this can be a very useful intervention. Okay, so a recommendation number 2. Remember with our pleasure-pain balance that when that initial stimulus is pleasure, those gremlins hop on the pain side, and with repeated exposure, we can end up in this dopamine deficit state. Well, the gremlins are agnostic to the initial stimulus. So if we start out by pressing on the pain side, those gremlins are actually going to hop on the pleasure side and help us reset our balance to the side of pleasure. So what I recommend to patients and recommend to you, if you want to engage in this experiment, is that in addition to abstaining from your drug of choice for a period of time, that you also invite painful activities into your life. And I actually mean physically painful, so things like exercise, things like ice cold water baths, but also cognitively and psychologically challenging tasks like doing something, that's intellectually very challenging, or engaging in a social interaction that maybe involves experiencing shame. Or I'm going to talk about radical truth telling in a second, telling the truth that's really painful when we have to expose, ways in which we've been selfish or harmed others. What happens essentially when we do that is that we tell the body that there's been an injury, and the body then starts to upregulate production of dopamine, and so then speeds up that return to homeostasis, or even ultimately resets things to the side of pleasure. Now, of course, it's also possible to get addicted to pain if we press too hard and too fast on the pain side of the balance, like cutting on ourselves or extreme forms of exercise that our bodies aren't ready for. That is not good. And essentially, then it becomes, in that same vicious cycle. So we want to be really thoughtful about that. The third thing that I prescribe to patients and that I recommend to folks trying to restore dopamine homeostasis is to engage in radical honesty. So radical honesty is when we tell the truth about everything, everything large and small, why we were late for the meeting, how much of something we did or saw or ate or consumed in some way, what we actually consumed, how we're actually spending our time. Why is it that telling the truth is fundamental to managing compulsive overconsumption? Well, first of all, let me say that it's something I learned from my patients. A consistent theme of my patients in sustained recovery from severe addiction, no matter how they got into recovery, was that they learned they had to be very, very honest, and that once they started lying, they were likely to relapse. Now, of course, people with severe addiction get to a point where they're lying about their addictive behaviors. And so stopping lying about that is really important to holding ourselves and others accountable. But the interesting piece here is that they also discovered that they couldn't lie about other things either, that part of being addicted is being in the lying habit. And part of getting out of addiction is this kind of radical truth telling. It turns out that the average adult tells 1 to 2 lies per day. This is the average adult, all comers. So we're all a little bit liars. And we just sort of do it reflexively, to protect ourselves. We think to protect others. And that means that not lying is hard. It requires effortful engagement. We have to actually kind of stand outside ourselves and be monitoring ourselves through the course of the day to sort of self-correct as we get that impulse to lie. But this is essentially the task of this radical honesty that can very much help us manage our compulsive overconsumption, no matter what our drug choice is. And there's some really, really interesting science behind it. So it turns out that when we are actively telling the truth, we're probably stimulating the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is that gray area matter behind our foreheads that's so important for delayed gratification, for future planning, and also for storytelling. So that when we're actively telling the truth, we're probably like working the muscle of our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex has lots of circuits that connect it to our reward pathway, our nucleus accumbens, that pleasure-pain balance. And we really need our prefrontal cortex to be actively engaged and online if we're going to be able to be aware of what's happening in the pleasure-pain pathway, what those gremlins are up to. The other piece of it is that pleasure-pain pathway and our, deep limbic structures, we have an incredibly sharp memory for initial stimuli. So what gives us pleasure and what gives us pain, but we're incredibly amnestic about the gremlins. So we don't tend to remember the opponent process. So for example, my patients will say, I have this incredible, vivid, euphoric recall of the first time I drank alcohol, how good it feels. And I feel like the whole history of my addiction has been trying to recreate that initial feeling. And I hear that so often, that the kind of vividness for that pleasurable stimulus, but not for all the bad stuff that follows on the heels of that. But likewise, we have this incredibly vivid memory for painful stimuli, but not for the good feelings we get afterwards. So for example, every morning when I wake up, I just feel a total dread of getting out of bed and exercising. And everything in my brain is telling me, stay in bed, it's comfortable, it's warm. And the reason is because exercise is painful, right? I don't want to have to exercise. And it's like I have to reteach myself every single day. Oh no, wait a minute. After you exercise, it sets up your day better. You feel so much better. You really should exercise. So one of the ways that we can maintain awareness of the gremlins and the opponent process mechanism is, in fact, to be radically honest with ourselves and others about our lived experience, because these autobiographical narratives that we tell about our lives are, number one, a way to organize our past, but also importantly, they predict our actions going forward. They essentially become a grid or a roadmap for what we choose to do going forward. So if we're telling narratives that are not truthful, we're likely to make the same mistake again and again. But if we're telling truthful narratives, it has a very powerful effect on our ability to make good choices going forward, especially when it comes to this problem of compulsive overconsumption. So because I'm really eager to have an interaction with all of you all, and I hope you have questions, I'm going to stop there. But what I hope you've gotten from this lecture is the ways in which our brains have evolved over millions of years to approach pleasure and avoid pain. The ways in which that primitive wiring is wonderfully adapted to a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, but highly mismatched for our modern ecosystem. I hope that you appreciate the kind of hypothesis that I've put forward, that the rising rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide that we're seeing, especially in wealthy nations, may be a direct result of too much dopamine, that essentially we're now down-regulating our own dopamine production and transmission to respond to this fire hose of pleasure that we're getting in our modern world, and that may indeed be the cause of rising despair, rather than some other putative causes that have been put forward. And finally, I hope that the recommendations that I've made are something that you might consider trying in your own life. Think about, what is that substance or that behavior that once I start, it's really hard stopping? I really wish I did less of that. It is interfering with my goals, with my values. Maybe I'm even lying about it. Take that thing and stop it for 30 days and know that you'll feel worse before you'll feel better. It's those gremlins hopping on the pain side. But if you can just abstain for long enough, you'll get to that place where really the window, the curtain's kind of open, the light comes in, you're able to focus on other things. And then I really invite you to invite pain into your life as a way to maintain that kind of balance. And then finally, radical honesty. Boy, I still am trying to learn how to do that. An amateur practitioner. There's so many ways in which we don't want to tell the truth about little things that make us look as broken and selfish as we can be. But I really recommend it as a way to stimulate the prefrontal cortex, as a way to create these autobiographical narratives. Words are really tools, and these narratives are roadmaps for living. So I hope this has been helpful for you, and I'd be happy to have questions and talk. Great, thank you.
Hi, Anna. So that was fantastic. Thank you very much. You've covered a lot of ground there in a very short space of time. So well done.
You're welcome. Okay, Ben, where can we learn more about the correlation between socioeconomic status and depression suicide rate? Ben, you can, not to be a plug, I can't remember the exact references, but if you read my book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, I list a whole bunch of references there that talk about, it's very clear. For example, there's a global happiness survey that was done showing that, people in rich nations like the United States, New Zealand, European nations were less happy in 2018 than they were in 2008. There are other survey studies looking at rates of generalized anxiety disorder, rates of depression, all of which clearly correlate, all of which are rising across the world and clearly correlate with socioeconomic status. So check out Dopamine Nation.
Perfect. And then I think I had a second question in the chat that had to do with when you're in your clinical practice and you're asking people to abstain from a compulsion or some activity that's addictive for 30 days, what do you kind of do to motivate these people to be able to stick to something like that?
Oh, great. Yeah. So what I do is I talk about it as an experiment, and people are coming in to see me because something's not right in their lives, right? For young people like you, it's often just that their parents breathing down their throat because they're smoking pot every day or something like that, playing video games longer than their parents want them to. So maybe the problem for that individual is just my parents won't get off my back. But very often it's things like depression, anxiety, insomnia, inability to concentrate, or just being unhappy. So what I say is, this is an experiment. Like nobody's got, a corner on all the answers, but clearly something's not working for you. Why don't you try this and see what you think? And the really exciting thing about this, Ben, is that for the vast majority of people, if they can make it to 30 days, they feel better. And because they feel better, I don't have to motivate them anymore. The motivation comes from inside because they've done their own experiment and they've seen that it works, and now they're motivated. And most of the time, folks will want to go back to using whatever their drug of choice is, but they want to use differently. They want to use less. They want to use in a way that they feel they have control over it and they're not being controlled.
Thank you. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So one anonymous attendee says, what is the effect of antidepressants such as venlafaxine on dopamine deficit? So this is a really good question. And I do talk about this in my book. I want to first emphasize that, as a psychiatrist, I prescribe antidepressants every clinic day. And I think they can be absolutely life-saving in some cases. However, from a neurobiological point of view, essentially what antidepressants are doing, usually mediated through serotonin, are ultimately pressing on this pleasure side of the balance. So you could theorize that with long-term use of antidepressants, you might actually develop gremlins on the pain side, i.e. develop tolerance. And could they even cause people long run to be depressed? There are some papers suggesting that this is a possibility. There's not a lot of evidence for this. There is also some evidence that they stop working over time, which is also this phenomenon of neuroadaptation. But I can name two other sort of psychotropics where there's clear adverse effects if used daily over a long period of time. The first one is benzodiazepine, so things like Xanax, Valium, Klonopin. Many people take that for anxiety and insomnia. I can tell you within a very short amount of time, you will end up in a dopamine deficit state, and you will have gremlins on the pain side of your balance, and you will have worse anxiety, worse insomnia. But here's the thing. When people are on benzos and then they get into that dopamine deficit state and they take the benzo, it feels like it's working because at least temporarily, they're out of the dopamine deficit state and their balance is, homeostatic. But actually what they're doing is perpetuating and exacerbating the anxiety state because they're just getting more gremlins, because as soon as that wears off. So the key is there, I have to teach my patients, I know it feels like when you take a Xanax, it's relieving your anxiety, but all it's probably doing at this point is treating withdrawal from your last dose. So we have to get you off for long enough to reset reward pathways so that you're not constantly, in this state of really progressive anxiety and medicating withdrawal. Same thing with opioids. So we thought here in the United States, we could cure our chronic pain problems by just like giving patients more opioids. And what we've seen is that the higher the dose and the longer the patients are on opioids, the more pain they have. And that when we get them off of opioids, their pain actually gets better. Now, is it a long, hard road to get off of opioids? Definitely. Do you have more pain as you're tapering? For sure, because like I said, the gremlins. But ultimately, by stopping for long enough, the gremlins get off and homeostasis is restored. I want to address one other quick thing that was anonymous. Do you ever find that addictions get replaced by other addictions rather than going away altogether? For example, stop overeating and start smoking. Absolutely. We have a name for it. It's called cross addiction. We see it in animal experiments. We see it in humans. So it's an important point that when you do this 30-day dopamine fast, don't just replace your one drug with another drug. Also, because any kind of priming of that reward pathway might trigger craving, you might want to stop multiple drugs at once. You don't have to, but for example, if you find that every time you drink coffee, that gives you craving to smoke a cigarette, you might think about doing your 30-day fast where you have no coffee and no cigarettes. And that might actually then be easy for you. And they're easier to do both than to do one or the other. And there are data showing that when people quit drinking and smoking at the same time, they have better outcomes for both.
How does antipsychotic medication help or hinder dual diagnosis clients, and also those that take their antipsychotic medication as prescribed versus those who don't?
Yeah. So in general, antipsychotics work by blocking dopamine receptors. Hey, there she is. They work by blocking dopamine receptors, but they don't. And they do cause a kind of slowing of mentation, and they can actually cause some depression, which kind of goes along with what you would think if you're blocking dopamine receptors. On the other hand, I wouldn't take any of that too concretely. It's not a one-to-one. This metaphor of the balance is a simplified sort of version of what's happening in the brain. And in general, if you are on an antipsychotic medication, either as a mood stabilizer or because you struggle with psychosis, and it's helping you, for goodness sakes, continue to take it. Also, what we find is that when people have severe mental illness like bipolar or schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders, if they're using addictive drugs, their medications don't work, right? So it's very, very important that if you have a severe mental illness, one of the very first things you might want to do is not use addictive substances, because it can really mess with your disease process, but also with those medications being able to do what they're meant to do.
Hello.
Yeah.
So I'm having problems with my video. I hope you'll mind the video not being on. Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Lembke. It's so interesting. What I wanted to ask you is how do you think ADHD fits into your dopamine deficit model? Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on how ADHD might fit into the dopamine deficit model?
Okay, yeah. So ADHD is, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's thought to be a disorder that mainly involves this prefrontal cortex, that gray matter area behind our foreheads that's involved in future planning, delayed gratification, this idea of not just distractibility, but also impulsivity, difficulty putting the brakes between a thought or desire to do something and actually doing it. We do know that people with ADHD are at higher risk of developing addiction in adult life, whether or not they've had treatment for ADHD in their younger lives. And so it's clear that ADHD and the phenomenon more broadly of addiction are interrelated, and that essentially, so first of all, we come with different degrees of vulnerability to the problem of addiction. We're not all equally vulnerable. And part of the vulnerability is inherited, and part of it is mediated by co-occurring mental illnesses like ADHD. So if you think about the prefrontal cortex as sort of the brakes on the car, and if you think about the reward pathway as the accelerator, in order to have a functioning car, you need to have brakes that are working and an accelerator that's working, and that they're working in conjunction. And so essentially probably what's happening, in ADHD is that there's some kind of defect with the brakes, so to speak, such that there's this loss of ability to see future consequences clearly, and also to just put the brakes on impulse control. And there's also a degree of emotion dysregulation that kind of then drives the reward seeking. There's even some theorization that people with ADHD are more reward seeking because they're relatively insensitive to normal dopamine spikes. So this is kind of theoretical, but this idea that the kind of hyperactive sensory seeking that you often see in people with ADHD might be an attempt to kind of get more feeling because they're not experiencing the same rewards with sort of everyday sort of rewards that are out there. There's also a similar hypothesis with people who have depression, right? This idea that the balance is actually not starting out level, right? That they're starting out with a balance tilted to the side of pain. And so they're seeking, just to restore homeostasis. But the key to remember is that even if you're starting out with a balance that's tilted to the side of pain, as you're like the way you were born, the gremlins don't care where you started out. If you press on that pain side of the balance, even if you started out in pain, they will hop more on the pain side of the balance and tilt you even further to the side of pain. So really, for people with depression and ADHD, the answer is for them to press even harder on the pain side as a way to try to restore homeostasis and get a level balance. One of the ways that I think about mental illness in general is that mental illness really is a mismatch between how we were wired and the world that we live in, which is to say that there are certain types of brains that now count as mental illness, but in like a different environment might be the most valuable people in the world. Like, so if you think about addiction and the vulnerability to addiction, what is that? That's the willingness to work a lot harder to get that drug, right? It's an incredible tenacity. And if you were living in a world of scarcity, those would be like the most valuable people in your tribe, right? Because they're the ones who are like waiting to walk 100 miles to find that one oasis, and everybody else is just sort of bumbling along behind. So I think, sometimes I think about that, like, or with bipolar disorder, like, what is it to get manic? It means, when people really get manic and have this hyper-religious experience, well, if we lived in a culture where we valued spirituality and those kinds of direct divine experiences in a different way, then those people would be shamans of sorts. They wouldn't be people who had lost touch with reality. This doesn't mean that I don't think mental illness is real. I do think mental illness is real. The brain is an organ like any other. It can go wrong. But I just think it's important to remember that these different traits that we call mental illness, they're endemic in our population. That means they're just always there. And they're probably there for a reason, because if suddenly our environment were suddenly to change, like God forbid, nuclear holocaust, and there were like 4 people left, you would hope that all 4 of them were addictive, right? And could really just like pedal to the metal to get like whatever those 4 people needed to be able to continue the species. So anyway, that's sort of tangential, but
That's super interesting, just to think that, these traits might have been adaptive in an evolutionary context, and the people that maybe have ADHD or whatever, like that comes from a past situation where it would have been highly adaptive to, go out and find novel stimuli and find, go exploring,
Yeah, right. And basically my hypothesis is that none of us are adapted for this environment, which is why we're all feeling like we're going crazy, right? So one of the things I talk about in my book, which I didn't have time for to talk about, it's just self-binding strategies. These are literal and metacognitive barriers we can put between ourselves and our drug of choice to help us abstain or use in moderation. But really what it's about is saying, hey, we live in a really crazy world. So we have to make micro environments like bubbles around ourselves in order to survive in this crazy world. And I really think that's true. Like we can't expect ourselves to be sane in a crazy world.
100%. Okay, we've got another anonymous question here from, well, obviously it's anonymous. Is hyperactivation or hypoactivation of dopamine pathways linked in any way to PTSD, i.e. rumination or recurring negative thoughts?
Interesting. I don't really know the answer to that. And I don't know how much science there is behind it, except that, when you think about like the incredible encoding we have in our hippocampus for either very painful stimuli or very pleasurable stimuli, what's essentially happening in PTSD, as we understand it, is that, you're in this dangerous situation, you get this hyperarousal state, a kind of a fight or flight mechanism. So you're secreting cortisol and adrenaline, you're in a state of hyperarousal. But then after it's over and everybody else has sort of calmed down and moved on, your body is still going, danger, danger, danger. So I think that there's possibly a way in which you could look at that as that you're addicted to danger. What does that mean? That there's some kind of neural circuits that have been set up such that you keep revisiting that place in a way that is actually reinforcing. Now, it's obviously, that seems counterintuitive, but it's a little bit like getting to the doom scrolling thing. Like, why would people get addicted to the news? It's all horrible. Like, how could that be addictive? But there's a way in which we can actually get addicted to bad stuff. I'll tell you about a really interesting experiment where they took a rat, they gave that rat a single injection of cocaine, they sliced open its brain, and they saw this incredible arborization of dopamine releasing neurons in the nucleus accumbens, which is the reward pathway. Then they took a rat and they gave it an incredibly painful foot shock. And what did they see? This incredible arborization of dopamine releasing neurons in the reward pathway. So there's a way in which extreme pain can actually function like an intoxicant. So this is all kind of theoretical, but I'll relate it to my own personal thing too. Like, I think that it's also possible to get addicted to our own anxious ruminations. And I know that I feel like I've been addicted to anxiety. Like, even if everything's great in my life, I'll find something to be anxious about, right? And it's kind of like my happy place. Like, being anxious is this weird, paradoxical place where I'm comfortable. So for me, what I have to do is abstain from anxious ruminations. I really do. Like, we have this idea in psychiatry that like you have to go deeper and deeper into your feelings. Sometimes you just have to not think those things. Like, you just have to go, I'm not going to stimulate that neural circuit. I'm going to deprive it of oxygen, and I'm going to, stimulate some other neural circuits. So anyway, I hope that's somewhat of an answer. Addicted to emotions. Yes. All right.
So just one final question here, Anna. So it seems that dopamine is sort of like the wanting neurotransmitter. It's the thing that gets us to focus on what we don't have and pursue things and strive for goals and everything.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about what your thoughts are about a gratitude practice and consciously focusing on what you do have and what's so good about that and how that relates to dopamine, and yeah, what might be happening there? Do you
Yeah,
think?
I think that gratitude practice is a good metacognitive strategy to sort of, go through and kind of count your blessings and realize like, wow, I have all these things that I can be grateful for. I don't need to ruminate in this unhappy place, and just kind of like, I mean, yes, I think it's a good strategy.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Right. Well, that's all we've got time for. Anna, that was a fantastic session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Um,
Great questions. I appreciate all the gratitude in the chat, and I'm glad it was helpful. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
and yeah, Anna's book, Dopamine Nation, you can get it Amazon, all the usual places. And any other final requests for people to check out online or anything, anywhere you'd like to send people?
Nope, this is good.
Okay. Okay,
All
cool.
right. Thanks, Niall. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care, Anna. See you later.